Please give a warm magenta welcome to Mr. Stephen Levitt.
Thank you, Karen. She mentioned that Indiana Jones quote from the Wall Street Journal. That was probably the high point of my career, being compared to Indiana Jones. But the excitement and the joy I felt was not long lasting, because it was just a couple weeks after that had come out in press that I was at a conference, a cocktail party with my wife and a bunch of other people, and I don't think she knew that I was within earshot. She was talking to some of the other women, and I heard one of the women say to her, well, what does it feel like to be married to the Indiana Jones of economics? And my wife thought about it for a second, and she said, Indiana Jones, I think Jim Jones might be a more apt comparison. I can tell I'm talking to a young crowd because you weren't around when he poisoned his followers, 1,000 of them, with Kool-Aid, and that's where I stand in my household with my wife. Now, let me tell you a story about a guy named John Szilagyi. He's the sort of gentleman you might all want to have working at your firms. He worked at the same organization for almost 30 years. He showed up to work on time, he had a good attitude, and on top of that, he had one idea. Okay, now I mean, I'd say one idea in 30 years, that's not so great, is it? Okay, but it turns out if you can make up for a low quantity of ideas, if you have high quality of ideas, and John Szilagyi's idea was high quality. Well, so who was this John Szilagyi guy? Well, it's actually perfect. I tell this story because it's just about tax time. And John Szilagyi worked at the IRS. That was his job. He was a tax auditor. He sat in the basement of some building, and he pored over tax forms looking for improprieties. Okay, now, I've met the guy, a nice guy. Okay, but he's a little weird. He had a sort of fetish. Okay, and the particular fetish that he had is that he absolutely went nuts when people gave crazy names to their kids. Okay, and the one that put him over the edge was a family that had named their daughter Fluffy, okay? And he thought, this is not right. People should not be naming children Fluffy. And he went to his bosses. This is back in the 1980s. He went to his bosses and he said, look, I've been looking at the 1040 tax form, okay? And right next to where you put the name of your dependents, there's a bunch of white space. Why don't we ask for the Social Security number of the dependents as well? Well, his bosses were kind of typical bosses. They said, we're doing fine the way we are now. Why would we want to rock the boat? And think about how much trouble it would be to change the tax forms. We'd have to, reprint everything and hold public hearings. And like, let's just keep on doing what we're doing. So John Szilagyi gave up on that idea. And 4 or 5 years passed. And he had a new set of bosses, and the demand for revenue at the IRS got louder. And they did something they've never done before or since. They actually went to the organization and they asked, does anyone have any ideas? And John Szilagyi came forward with that old idea that he had. And he told his bosses, and they thought it was a good idea. They decided to go to the trouble and reprint the tax forms and hold the public hearings. And on April 16th, 1987, something really amazing happened. It turned out that overnight, 7 million children vanished from the face of the earth. I mean, we're talking about disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. Okay, and it wasn't the biggest kidnapping wave in history, but it was work of one man alone, and that was John Szilagyi. Because it turns out, if you believe the data, that 7 million children were being completely and utterly fabricated by their parents on the tax forms to get the $250 dependent deduction that goes with having a dependent. Okay? That's 1 in 10 children in America, if you can believe it, were being made up by their parents. So how good was John Szilagyi's idea? Well, 250 times 7 million, do the math, I think that turns out to be, we're talking about a couple $2 billion worth of revenue. And not just one time, every year. These children had lives. They kind of propagated over and over. Who knows if they would have reproduced among each other and had families and made things spread. So in present discounted value, John Szilagyi's idea is probably worth something like $20 billion, $15 billion. Okay? Well, the funny thing is that the IRS that year, as they went through bonuses, John Szilagyi got overlooked for a bonus. They passed him over. $20 billion is not good enough for a bonus at the IRS. I guess you need $40 billion to get a bonus. But the thing that drove John Szilagyi crazy when we met with him later, it wasn't the money. It's that he had this idea that when he walked into the lunchroom, the dining hall at the IRS, that people might stand and clap for him, or they might put a big picture of him on the wall because of his great idea. But nobody cared. Nobody gave him any credit. Nobody was worried about it. And it really broke his spirit, and he retired very disgruntled. Now, as I started to work on this problem, look at these data, it just, sometimes you use your intuition, it just doesn't feel right. Could it really be possible that Americans are so morally bankrupt that 1 in 10 children in America were being made up? And it didn't sit right with me. And I was talking to my parents about this research and telling them what I was doing. And actually, my dad confided to me that I myself had lost both a brother and a sister on that fateful night in 1987. And I thought, maybe we're really onto something here. This could be the real deal. What I love about John Szilagyi and why I like to tell that story is it's a story about ideas, okay? And the right kind of ideas, because it's just my belief that people don't spend enough time thinking about ideas, okay? And when I say ideas, I don't mean huge ideas like string theory or the theory of relativity. I mean the little things that are out there that make a difference, that should be totally obvious, but for reasons I've never been able to understand, are really hard for us to see, things that are right there. And think about John Szilagyi. As you reflect on, well, of course you should have the Social Security number of the dependent on the tax form. I mean, it's obvious. Okay, but somehow, in the first 70 years of our tax code, nobody thought to do it. Okay, $20 billion, $2 billion a year, over and over for 70 years, just lost because nobody thought to do it. And it wasn't like no one had the chance. There must have been, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 guys who had the exact same job as John Szilagyi, who saw the exact same data, okay, data in the form of names, crazy names coming through. In this case, Fluffy was the one that really triggered it for him. But nobody else saw it. As soon as John Szilagyi says it, it's obvious, right? Then it becomes clear. Of course we should do it, but somehow people can't see it. Okay? And I think that to me is, as I think about working and making a contribution, it's those kind of ideas that can change careers, can change companies, change the direction of society. And yet I think we're so busy doing reports and dealing with customers and handling whatever comes in, that we don't have the luxury of doing it. Okay? Unless, of course, you're somebody like me, okay, and you're an academic. And our academic system is so crazy and broken in this country that I teach at the University of Chicago, and my requirements in terms of teaching add up to about 50 hours per year. Okay, that's how much time I spend in the classroom. So I have all the rest of my time to do whatever I want. I play some golf, I come talk to nice folks like you, but one of the things I've always done is to focus on ideas. So probably for the last 25 years, I've spent at least 10 hours a week just thinking, trying to come up with ideas. Okay? And it turns out I'm not that good at it, really. I'm probably a lot worse than almost anybody else would. I call it a good year if I can come up with one or even 2 ideas would be a phenomenal year, 2 good ideas. Okay? But I spend 500 hours, so it's about 250 or 300 hours per idea. Okay? Which doesn't seem like a great investment, except if you cobble together 10 or 15 good ideas, and you put them in a book and you call it Freakonomics, and then you sell 5 million copies, you say, well, that was pretty good investment after all. I'm kind of glad I did that. But if you know me, you know my ideas they're not theory of relativity or string theory kind of ideas. They're silly ideas. They're little ideas, not even ideas that other economists usually think very much of. It's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a real economist, right? My idol growing up was Alan Greenspan. And I wanted to be the kind of economist who, when I made a terrible mistake of judgment, the world got thrown into convulsions and markets got turned upside down. That's the badge of honor. That's what we're all going for in economics. But I realized early on I didn't really have the skills it took. And in particular, it turns out that, ironically, if you survey my colleagues in academic economics, only 2% of us on a multiple choice survey said that having a good working knowledge of the economy was critical to being a good economist. Okay? And it was just a sad statement. It's why there are no economists at your firms, and economists don't really matter in the world. What economists think matters is math. Okay? Over 70% of my colleagues said the most important thing to succeed in economics was math. Okay, and unfortunately for me, that is an accusation of being proficient at math that has never been leveled at me. And it goes all the way back to when I was in high school, and I took honors calculus from a guy who I remember well. His name is Mr. Drexel, a mean-spirited, older gentleman. He was the kind of teacher you might have had who, when a student didn't know an answer, he wasn't content to just let it go. He would stand over you, and he would bully you, and he'd try to somehow prod the answer out of you when you had no idea what he was talking about. And I was by far the worst kid in this class, the worst student, and I became the whipping boy. And to this day, I continue to have occasional nightmares where Mr. Drexel is looming over me, and he's drawn some kind of saddle shape on the blackboard, and he's telling me to rotate it, and I have no idea what he's talking about. All right? Now, you don't often get a chance to strike back at bullies like that and give them retribution, okay? But in my case, I actually did, because for reasons I never really fully understood, this Mr. Drexel character showed up at my 15-year high school reunion, okay? And there he was, and he was not a young man, because he had been in his mid-60s when he had taught me, so he must have been 80 by the time we got to this reunion. And I thought to myself, what can I possibly do to punish him for all the angst that he's given me over all these years? And I decided what I'd do to him would be the punishment that my own students hand out so incredibly effectively to me. I'll be minding my own business, say in the grocery store around campus, when some fresh-faced, smiling person will bound up to me and they'll say, "Professor Levitt." And I'll say, "Oh no," because I have no idea who they are. It's as if I've never seen them before, but I know they must be a former student, and I know they expect me to know them. And we have the most horrible, awkward interactions imaginable, where I try to pretend I know them, but by the time we're done, everybody knows that I don't know who they are, and it's this awful feeling, this awful feeling in the pit of your stomach that will haunt me for the entire day. So I said, well, that's what I'm going to do to Mr. Drexel, but I'm not going to be nice the way my students usually are to me. I'm going to make it as hard on him as possible. So I strode up to him, and I said, "Mr. Drexel," and I smiled at him. And he looked at me, as you'd expect, completely blankly. But after a few seconds, he kind of started to smirk. And I wondered why he was smirking. But then he spoke. He said, "Wait a second. Did you get a 2 on the calculus AP exam?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I did get a 2 on the calculus AP exam." He said, "That is the single lowest score of any student I ever taught in honors calculus." I remember you now, and the memories of just how terrible I was at math came flooding back to him. And then I proved that too was no fluke when I showed up at college. I went to Harvard, and they did a battery of tests to figure out what you should do. And the class, guidance counselor sits me down, and she says, "Now, when it comes to math, my recommendation for the class you should take is a class called Math 1A. Okay? It's the single lowest offering. It's high school math at Harvard. It was basically, I took the class. Okay? It was me and maybe 12 other students, and I'd say the average height of those students was like 6 feet 3 inches tall, and the average weight was like 240 pounds. It was all the people that Harvard let in as athletes who had like no academic credentials whatsoever. So it turns out I could smoke those guys. I got an A in Math 1A. But I had enough sense to never take another math course for the rest of my life. Went and did consulting, and then I had this brilliant idea, I thought, this epiphany. I should go and become an academic economist. Okay, I had no idea what it took to be one. I applied to schools, and for reasons I still can't say I fully understand, I was admitted to MIT's PhD program in economics. Okay, the most rigorous, mathematical, technical program in the world. Okay, I had no idea, but look, I had this new life starting. I was so optimistic about how great being an academic economist would be. And I showed up at class, and that optimism lasted, no more than 2 or 3 minutes into the first lecture. The professor was scribbling these equations up on the board. And I remembered enough from Math 1A, which would have been, I guess, 7 or 8 years earlier, to know that when there was a D in an equation, it stood for a derivative. Okay, that's good. So the thing that was a little weird, though, is as the lecture went on, it almost seemed like the professor was putting up two different kinds of D's on the board. It's like a regular old D, and then there's this other D that looked like it was kind of like a cursive D or a script D, but I'd never seen one of those in an equation, so I just assumed it was bad penmanship, and I just wrote down D, 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 and I didn't worry about what was going on. But the longer this lecture went on, the more worried I got, because I've always been kind of good at pattern recognition, and these regular D's were always one on top of each other, and then these other D's were always one on top of each other, and the longer I sat there, I realized this was not bad, penmanship. There was something I didn't understand. But what was I going to do? I mean, it was the first day of class. I couldn't really raise my hand and say, I don't understand what's going on. So I finally broke down, though, and I turned to the guy next to me, and I whispered in his ear. I said, hey, is there a difference between the straight D and the curly D? And he turned back to me, and he simply said, you are in so much trouble. Oh, man, was he right? Was I in so much trouble? Because that curly D, of course, you probably all know, it's a partial derivative. It's like the most easiest, like most fundamental thing in all of economics. But I'd never heard of it, never seen it. The idea had never crossed my mind. Okay, it wasn't just that. It was every single day some new piece of math. I was so unprepared, and I was completely out of my league. And that was obvious to me. It was obvious to my teachers. It was obvious to my peers. I was just the mistake, right? I was the guy who never should have been there. Okay? And the only thing that saved me is a fundamental characteristic of economists, which is that we are driven by self-interest, okay? That economists believe in doing what's best for them, okay? And it turns out, sadly, that in the 1970s, there had been a wave of suicides at MIT, okay? And so they had put in a set of regulations which makes it very, very time-intensive to fail a student at MIT. The professor had to go through a series of steps to justify the failure of a student, okay? And each of my professors, in their own self-interest, was too lazy to go through those steps and give me a failing grade, okay? Which was great news for me because they passed me step by step, with C's and D's on to the next professor, and that's how I managed to stagger my way to Christmas break at MIT, okay? So I went back home to the Twin Cities where I grew up, and I pondered my fate. I mean, obviously, if I had any sense, I would just drop out. Okay, but I hated being a consultant. I wasn't a good consultant either. I wasn't a good economist. I wasn't a good consultant. But at least it was so embarrassing to think about going back and telling my old consulting company I'd flunked out of MIT in just one semester. So as I pondered my fate, I asked my parents. I said, what do you think I should do? And my father actually gave me the one and only inspirational speech that I think he's ever given me in my life. Because I already told you about my father. He's more of the cheat on your taxes kind of father than the inspirational speech kind of father. So here's what he said to me. This is a true story. You're not going to believe it, but I swear to God this is a true story. So it's back when my father's a medical researcher. He's a doctor, okay? And if you want to be a medical researcher, you start by getting your going to med school, and then you do an internship and a residency, and then you need to do a research fellowship. Okay, it's very competitive. Somehow, I never really got this part of the story. My dad had gotten invited from the University of Minnesota, where he had gone to school, to do a research fellowship at one of the most prestigious hospitals in Boston, in the entire world, okay, with one of the most famous doctors in the world, a guy named Franz Engelfinger, who would eventually be the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. My father somehow found himself at the very pinnacle of medical research. And things were going great for the first 2 months, until his mentor, the guy who brought him there, sat him down in the office and said something to him. He said, Levitt, I'm sorry to say, but you have no talent for medical research. Can you imagine my dad's horror when the guy says this? Okay, but he's not done talking. He goes on. He says, there is, however, one area of science which is so devoid of knowledge that even someone with your severe limitations might be able to make a contribution. So my dad says, well, what area is this? And the guy says to him, intestinal gas. Okay. Now, others might have done differently, but my dad takes those words to heart, okay? And you think I'm joking, but he devotes his entire professional career to the study of intestinal gas, okay? He becomes the world's foremost medical expert in the topic. And recognized not just within the profession, okay, with all sorts of accolades, but he even gets to be kind of a media darling. GQ, when I was in high school, GQ does this 2-page pictorial spread on my dad's research. And the headline reads, "The King of Farts," they call my dad. So here's what he says to me. He says, "Look, I had no talent, you have no talent. If you want to succeed in a profession for which you have no talent, the only hope you have is to take on the most embarrassing and degrading topics imaginable that no self-respecting member of the profession will go anywhere near." Okay? I thought about it and I said, well, I don't have a lot of other options, so what the heck? Why don't I give it a shot? And essentially, I think what I've seen over the last 20 years is that the apple just does not fall far from the tree in the Levitt household. And I don't know what's more embarrassing, the fact that I've spent my life studying ridiculous topics like catching cheating sumo wrestlers and studying a crack-selling gangs, financial records, or looking at crazy names and the kind of things I do. Okay, or the fact that you're sitting in the audience, willing to listen to me talk about the fact that I've studied those things for the last 20 years. Now my time is short today, so I talked about ideas at the beginning. And usually I make fun of other people. I make fun of real estate agents. I compare them to the KKK, and I've done some controversial stuff where I've made connections between abortion and crime. But sometimes people get sensitive when you make fun of them. So instead of making fun of other people, I want to make fun of economists today, because we're just as ripe for being made fun of as others. Okay. So to do it, though, I got to give you a little bit of the backstory. Okay. So I already said economists believe that we're motivated by self-interest, okay? That people do what's best for them, and they're not worried about the world as a whole, and they're not altruistic. And it drives people crazy. That's, the dismal profession, stuff like that, okay? Now, a renegade set of economists came along in the 1970s and 1980s, and they disagreed with this view. They thought that there's ample evidence that people would do the right thing and they cared about others. But how to prove it? It's really hard to prove that in the real world, because you just never know when you have a chance to play this, sort of a repeated game interaction, whether people are doing things for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. So, it used to be when a barn would burn down, in the prairie back in the 1800s, everyone in the community would rally around and they'd build the barn back up for that unlucky person whose barn built down. Okay, but was that because people cared about other people, or because they were worried that someday their own barn was going to burn down and no one would help them if they didn't help the others? Okay? So it's really difficult always to tease out motives. Okay? But how do you do it? Well, these renegade economists had a great idea. They said, let's go into the lab, because economists don't usually go into the lab like psychologists do, but let's use lab experiments to try to tease out human behavior. Okay? And they came up with an incredibly simple game that could get at this issue. Okay? And the game is called the dictator game. I can explain to you in about 30 seconds. So, 2 college students will come in to a lab. They'll respond to some invitation, and you pay them, say, $10 a piece. Okay? They're never going to meet. They come in different doors into different rooms. It's completely anonymous. Okay, it's going to be a one-shot game, and they each get paid their $10, and then they flip a coin. The experimenter does. And if it comes up heads, the first guy gets the title of the dictator. If it comes up tails, the second guy gets to be the dictator. Okay, the entire game involves the dictator being handed $10 more in $1 bills, okay, in an envelope, and all that happens is the dictator gets their own $10, and then they can divide the next $10 however they like. Okay, they can keep it all for themselves, they can give it all away, split it 50-50. Okay, and then that money is given to the other person in the experiment, okay, who has no role but just to sit there and wait to be given money or not given money, and then they leave out different doors, and you're done. Okay, it's the entire experiment. So think about that for a second. Let's say you get the lucky flip of the coin and you get to be the dictator, and you're given this $10. How much of it do you give to this anonymous stranger who's on the other side of the wall? Okay, and it should be one-shot game. You're done. Once it happens, you're gone. Okay, so think about that. Anybody give all $10 away? Wow, tough crowd here. Usually there's one Mother Teresa type around who claims that he or she would give away all $10. Although it never happens in the lab. No one ever gives away the $10 in the lab. What about 5? Who gives away half the money? Yeah, again, a pretty tough crowd, because that's the most popular That's the most popular thing when you play this with students. They give away 5. Who gives away nothing? Good. Okay, well, it turns out that there's one really strong predictor of giving away nothing. And usually about 10 to 15% of the people give away nothing. Single best predictor is being an economics major in college. For you guys who said nothing, being an economics major in college, we don't know if it's a treatment effect or a learning effect. Okay? But in general, people give away a lot. Between 30, 35% of the money that the dictator's given, they hand over to the stranger. Okay? And it drives economists crazy, okay? Because it doesn't make any sense. You know, wouldn't you rather keep the money for yourself? It's a total stranger. You won't get any credit for it. Okay? And it really challenges the economic models. Okay? And consequently, as these experiments are done, it led to a whole kind of revisionist history in economics where now many of the newer, younger economists are writing different theories that involve altruism and fairness. And there's so much of a big wave that's changed the entire profession. And a lot of it comes down to studies like this. And they've been done 50, 100 times. Always replicated, always people are generous. So I've seen those studies, and I gotta say I'm always a little bit unsure about them. Because, you know, I lived in Boston for 10 years, and I took the subway back and forth from school and from work every day. Okay? But not once in all that time did a stranger come up to me just as the doors were about to open at my stop, open up his wallet, say, hey, you know, I got 10 bucks in my wallet, but I really want to give you 3 of them. And then hand me the money and get off the train and disappear. Well, it happens in the lab every day. I mean, people try dying to give away $3 in the lab. Why don't they give away that money on the train? Okay? And so I was talking with a friend of mine, a guy named John List. He's an experimental economist. And as we talked about it, he said, I think I have an idea. Okay? And it was going to turn out to be an interesting idea. He said, I think I understand what's going on in this experiment. So he started by just replicating what everyone else did and his set of students, and he got the exact same results. Students incredibly, incredibly generous. So then he did a little tweak to the experiment. What he did was he, instead of just saying, you know, you can give away $10 or nothing or anywhere in between, he changed the rules so the dictator could not just do that, but also if they wanted, the dictator was allowed to steal one of the dollars from the person on the other side of the wall. Okay, so they got 10 to start with. The dictator could actually say, no, you've got to give me one of those. Okay, so what should happen? Well, you'd think almost nothing, because almost everybody, 85, 90% of the people, wanted to give money away to that other person. Okay, and if you want to give money away, prefer that to giving 0, then presumably you're not going to want to steal the money, right? Because you could have given them nothing and gave them something. Why would you want to steal it? The only people you think who would actually change their behavior would be the economics majors who were already at 0, and they wanted to steal the dollar, they just weren't allowed to steal it by the rules. Okay? So what happened? So when they actually played that game, it turned out to be very different than what you might expect. So almost no one anymore gave away $5. Okay? Virtually no one gave away $5. A lot of people used to give 5 or 4 or 3. Many of those people now gave 0. Okay, the most popular answer became to give 0. And completely predictably, the only people who really were following the right model, the economists, they all stole the money from the person, just as we would predict. Okay? So that little tweak in the game, just changing the rules, which shouldn't have mattered very much, led the giving to go from maybe 35% down to about 10%. Okay? So why stop there? So he did another experiment. This time he said, as a dictator, you can give away all of your $10, you can give away none of your $10. And in addition, if you want, you can steal up to the entire $10 that was given to the other person for showing up to this game. Okay, so if that happens, you as a dictator walk away with $30, the $10 you were given, the $10 that you give away, and then the $10 the other guy, and that guy walks away with 0. Okay? So what do you think happened? What would you do in that game? Now you're the dictator. How much you give away? How much you steal? 0 might be a reasonable thing. I kind of think I might take 5. You know, leave the guy with $5, but not take the whole thing. It turned out that the actual answer of what happens, the single most common response of the students, was to steal the entire $10 from the person on the other side of the wall and to walk away with 30 instead of 0. Okay? On average now, the amount they take is between $4 and $5. Okay? And you say, wait a second. For a decade and for 100 studies, people played the dictator game, And what we learned from it was how generous and fairness and equalizing people were. Okay? But then John List comes along and he changes the rules a little bit, and all of a sudden you turn these people into the most crazy set of thieves imaginable. How is that consistent? Okay? And I think there's only one story that really makes sense of it. The story that the renegade economist told was one in which the reason people gave the money away is because they cared about the people on the other side, right? It was a fairness story. It was an equity story. And that's what we built our models around afterwards. But what John List showed us, it was actually something totally different. Okay? What happened was I got in the lab, and there's some guy like me, some professor standing over you, recording every action you do. And the real decision you faced as a dictator was, what's the least amount of money that I can give away without looking like a total jerk in front of my professor? Okay? And in the original game, where you can give away between 0 and 10, a lot of people felt like they had to give away 5, or maybe give away 3, not to look like a jerk. Okay? Now you allow people to steal $1. Then you say, well, geez, if I don't steal, I'm not a jerk, so I don't have to give away any as long as I'm not a stealer. Okay? And then when you let people steal the entire 10, people say, well, I really don't want to look like a jerk in front of the professor, but for $30, I guess that's just going to be what's going to happen. Okay? Okay? So what you learn from these experiments is roughly the trade-off between how much a student is willing to pay not to look like a jerk, and it's somewhere between about $20 and $30 is what the student's willing to pay not to look like embarrass himself. Okay? So what really makes John List great is what he does next. And so, what's weird about this is what motivated my story was the idea that I was on the subway in Boston and people were never giving me money. Okay, but people also weren't stealing money. I didn't get mugged once a single time I was on the subway. So John List does one last little lab experiment. Instead of letting the kids just come in and he hands them $10 and then they go off and do his little experiment, he actually tricks them. They come into the lab, and instead of doing this fun psychology experiment, for another project he was doing, it was a direct mail project, and he needed a bunch of envelopes stuffed and addressed. Okay? So he makes these poor kids work for an hour stuffing and addressing envelopes to earn their $10. Okay? So they work hard, both the dictator and the other person. They get their $10, and then he has them play that last version of the game. Okay? Now, what do you think happens? It turns out that almost everybody, 90% of the people, do the exact same thing in that game, and that is the dictator gives exactly 0 to the other person. The dictator keeps the money that they earned, and he lets the other person keep the money that they earned. Okay? Even though when the person didn't earn the money, the dictator was happy to steal it. Okay? Basically, what John List managed to do was to recreate in the lab something which is very much like what really happens in the real world, where people more or less mind their own business, okay? And they help out other people maybe in a jam, and but by and large, the model that economists had seems to work pretty well. That we care about people, but we really care about ourselves more than we care about other people. Now, what's so interesting to me is that there's a whole set of economists. I don't know, there might be 15 economists who devoted their entire life to this line of research. Okay, and I know these economists, and they whisper in the background about how they're going to win the Nobel Prize for their groundbreaking work on fairness. And what's interesting is they basically got it totally wrong. They misinterpreted their own life's work for 20 years until John List came along and did one incredibly simple experiment, which overnight made it completely and totally clear what the truth was. Okay, and that's what I call a powerful idea, when one guy sees through what no one else could see at all. Now, I've made a lot of people angry over the course of my career. I talked about the abortion and crime research, and I caught a bunch of teachers cheating, so the teachers union hate me, and real estate agents hate me more than anyone. They despise me for the things I've said about them. So when I got a letter in the mail, this is now about 3 years ago, and it was a strange, longer than that, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it was handwritten, all capital letters, no return address, okay? And in the bottom corner, it said, very important, okay? And I fingered this envelope, I looked at it, and one word came to mind, okay? And it was anthrax. This just felt like a letter that was going to be laced with anthrax. So I called my wife over and I said, hey, honey, could you open this envelope for me? And she did, and I'm happy to say there was no anthrax in the letter. Indeed, inside this envelope, of all the things it could have said, what it said inside this envelope was, John List is wrong, okay? And inside the envelope, with nothing else except for that, was a $20 bill, okay? And I realized what had happened. I had told this story about John List incredibly misguidedly at a reunion of Teach for America alumni, okay? Not really thinking about the fact that every one of them thought that they had done the right thing, had been so generous. And the subtext of what I was saying is no one's ever really doing things for the right reasons if they're being generous. They're just, you just got to figure out why they were being selfish. That's not self-evident. And I realized I'd really ticked somebody off and telling this story, and they had sent me this $20 bill to make a point, which in the real world, maybe in the economist models it doesn't happen, but in the real world sometimes people actually do these things, these acts of kindness that can't possibly get any credit. So I'll tell you, the most important thing that I'll say today is this. You might even want to write it down, it's that important. 5807 South Woodlawn Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, 60637. If there's anything I've ever done in my books or in this talk which has really set you off, I want to hear from you. And the bigger the denomination, the more responsive I will be to the concerns that you have. All right, so let me end with one quick story. One quick story about unintended consequences, which is another theme of Freakonomics. And I get emails, probably 50 emails a day from people who've read my book. Most of them not that interesting, occasionally really interesting. And one of the most interesting I ever got was an email that started, I'm a high-priced escort in the city of Chicago, and I have learned from a mutual acquaintance of ours that you're doing research on prostitution in Chicago, which was indeed true. I was doing research on prostitution. She went on to say, I have a Palm Pilot with all of the data on all of the clients that I've ever served. Is that the sort of data you're trying to collect in your prostitution study? And I wrote her back immediately, and I said, absolutely, that's the kind of data I'm trying to collect. Would you be interested in sharing it? And she said, as a matter of fact, I'd be happy to share it with you. Why don't we meet for brunch on Saturday to talk about the handover of the data? So I said yes. Now, I had a small problem. I told you I got a wife. I have 4 young kids, and I had to explain to my wife how I was going to have brunch with a prostitute that Saturday. And I said, honey, I promise you, she called me, not vice versa, and it's just about the Palm Pilot. So she was understanding. She thought it was okay. I went and met the lady. Turned out to be fascinating. I was doing research on street prostitutes, and we were putting our trackers out in the street corners, and we were recording data trick by trick. It was actually, we write about it in Super Freakonomics, the most interesting research I ever did. I mean, among the things we found out that if you were a street prostitute, you were more likely to have sex with the Chicago police officer than to get arrested by a Chicago police officer, okay? Okay, but that's not the point of this story. This story is about my escort friend. So anyway, we sit down and we talk about stuff, and we work out how to deal with the data, and it takes about 5 minutes, and there we are, and I'm thinking, what are we going to talk about at brunch? We have 35, 40 minutes, and because of Freakonomics, I get to talk to a lot of CEOs, and I have a kind of set of questions, and so I just figured I'll just get her talking as much as possible. I'll just bomb questions at her about prostitution industry, and maybe I'll learn something about it. And it turned out she was incredibly knowledgeable, very smart in thinking about her industry. And it was only when I asked her the toughest problem that I tripped her up. And the toughest problem in business, I believe, is how to set prices. Nobody has any idea what the right prices are to charge. So I asked her, how did you choose your prices? And she kind of hemmed and hawed, and she said, well, I didn't know what to charge, so I just went online, and I looked at the other women who have web pages, and a lot of them were charging in like $300, and so I just decided to charge $300 as well. Okay, and that answer drives economists crazy, because we're not good at most things, but one thing we're really good at is knowing how to set prices, right? We have a formula. If you know your marginal cost, right, and you know the elasticity of demand, there's something called the inverse elasticity rule. It tells you exactly what price to charge. It's got nothing to do with what the other women are doing. It's got nothing to do it's just, that's not how you price, and it makes us mad when people don't do that. But nobody does it the way we want it to. I've learned that over time. So I tried to figure out whether I could help her. Okay, what could I possibly ask her that would help her solve her problem? And suddenly I remembered she had told me she had a dedicated phone line that only her clients called on. And so I asked her, how do you feel when that phone rings? And she said, well, I'm kind of indifferent. A lot of times I don't even pick up the phone if I'm not in the mood, and so, I don't care that much whether my clients call me. I said, my God, you're a local monopolist. You got a downward sloping demand curve. If you could sell one more unit of your good at the same price as your last one, and you were operating, of course you'd want to do it. I mean, you can't, if you don't want to pick up the phone, you can't be charging a high enough price. But look, economics wasn't her thing. She was a call girl. I mean, she wasn't, and I wasn't there to maximize her profits. I was just trying to figure out how to get her data. And so we dropped it, and I figured I'd never see her again. But then I teach a class at University of Chicago, on the economics of crime. And because I was researching prostitution, I thought, well, maybe I should add a lecture. But it's hard to write a good lecture, and I struggled with it. And then I had an idea. Why don't I invite my call girlfriend, and she can guest lecture and teach for me, and that'll be way better than any lecture that I could ever do. So I called her on the phone. I said, hey, how would you feel about coming and giving my lecture? She said, oh, well, I'm a very private person, and I'm a terrible public speaker. I could never do it. But I know a lot about economists and enough about prostitutes to know that we have one really important thing in common, which is can't. This is not a word in our vocabulary, right? You just got to find the right price, and we'll do whatever you want us to do. So I said, what if I pay your hourly wage to come and teach my class? And she said, oh, from hourly wage? Oh, I didn't understand. I'd be delighted to come teach your class. You just tell me what day I need to do it. She came down, she gave me the most incredible lecture. I mean, a third of my students told me that it was the single best lecture they had had in the 4 years they had attended the University of Chicago, which is an incredibly sad statement about what me and my colleagues are doing in the classroom, but not inaccurate. After she spoke, we had Q&A, and one of the students raised his hand, and he said, well, how much do you charge? She said, I charge $400 an hour. Okay, and I become furious, because I know she charges $300 an hour. I just met with her, a month earlier, and it's not like, I'm paying her hourly wage out of my pocket. I can't get the National Science Foundation to, give me a grant. I'm too lazy to teach my own class to hire a prostitute to come do it for me. So I'm just absolutely fuming at the thought that she's like ripping me off. I thought we had some kind of relationship going of trust and stuff. So then the next student raises her hand, and she says, well, how did you decide how much to charge? And the prostitute turns to me. I'm sitting over there, and she's got this big beaming smile on her face, and I'm absolutely furious. And she says, well, the very first time that I met with Professor Levitt, she says, the very first time that I met with Professor Levitt, he convinced me my services were far more valuable than the $300 I was currently charging. So I raised my price to $400 an hour. I tell you, it is the best business decision I have ever made. I've got $5,000 extra in the bank because of him. So, look, I don't know. I'm not like Magento. I can't create tons of value for you guys in your own business, but I tell you what, any prostitutes, you send them my way, and I guarantee you I will increase their bottom line. So thank you so much. Have a great conference. Take care.